Nothing escalates our understanding of history quite like a fresh examination of its most pivotal moments. Pearl Harbor stands as one of those defining events, a military strike that propelled America into World War II and forever altered the course of global politics. But beneath the surface of this well-documented attack lies a complex web of diplomatic failures, cultural misunderstandings, and human decisions that, when re-examined, reveal a far more nuanced story than most history books suggest. The conventional narrative of Pearl Harbor paints a simple picture: a treacherous surprise attack by Imperial Japan against an unsuspecting America. But what if I told you that the attack wasn't entirely unexpected? What if both nations had been locked in a diplomatic chess match for months, with moves and countermoves that made conflict increasingly inevitable? The truth is that Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military event. It was the culmination of economic warfare, cultural pride, and diplomatic brinkmanship that had been building for years. Let's start by setting the stage. By 1941, tensions between Japan and the United States had reached a breaking point. Japan's imperial ambitions in Asia clashed directly with American interests in the Pacific. The U.S. had imposed crippling economic sanctions, including an oil embargo that threatened to strangle Japan's economy and military capabilities. For a resource-poor island nation like Japan, these sanctions weren't just political pressure. They were existential threats. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood America better than most Japanese leaders. Having studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, he had a profound respect for American industrial might. "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences," he famously warned, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." This wasn't bravado. It was a clear-eyed assessment from a man who knew that Japan couldn't win a prolonged war against the United States. Yet despite his misgivings, Yamamoto devised a plan that he hoped might give Japan a fighting chance. The strategy was bold: deliver a knockout blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, crippling America's ability to interfere with Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia. With the U.S. temporarily neutralized, Japan could secure the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and establish a defensive perimeter in the Pacific that would be too costly for America to penetrate. The plan's success hinged on complete surprise. And here's where our story gets interesting. Despite popular belief, the attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't entirely unexpected by American intelligence. In the months leading up to December 7, 1941, there were numerous warning signs that Japan was planning something significant. American cryptanalysts had partially broken Japan's diplomatic codes, allowing them to intercept and read messages between Tokyo and its embassies abroad. These intercepts, known as magic, provided valuable insights into Japanese intentions. On November 27, 1941, just 10 days before the attack, Washington sent a war warning to all Pacific commands, including Hawaii. The message stated that hostile action possible at any moment and that an aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. Similar warnings were issued on subsequent days. Yet despite these alerts, the commanders at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, failed to put their forces on high alert. Why? The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of Japanese capabilities and intentions. American military planners believed that if Japan attacked, it would target the Philippines, Guam, or other American possessions in the Western Pacific, not Hawaii, which was considered too distant for Japan to strike. There was also a prevailing belief that Japan wouldn't dare attack America directly, given the overwhelming industrial superiority of the United States. This underestimation of Japan was compounded by racial prejudice. Many American leaders dismissed Japanese military capabilities, believing that Japanese pilots couldn't match their Western counterparts and that Japanese technology was inferior. Admiral William Halsey reportedly said before the war that the Japanese couldn't hit the side of a barn. This cultural arrogance blinded American leaders to the very real threat that Japan posed. Meanwhile, Japan was meticulously planning its attack. The operation was led by Commander Minoru Genda and Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the 6 aircraft carriers that would launch the strike. The Japanese pilots trained relentlessly, practicing torpedo runs in shallow waters similar to Pearl Harbor's. They modified their torpedoes with wooden fins to allow them to run in the shallow harbor. Every detail was considered, from the timing of the attack, early Sunday morning, when most American sailors would be off guard, to the flight path that would avoid detection. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese strike force, known as Kido Butai, departed from Tankan Bay in the Kuril Islands. Maintaining strict radio silence, the fleet took a northern route across the Pacific, avoiding shipping lanes to prevent detection. The journey was fraught with challenges, including rough seas and the constant fear of discovery. Yet somehow, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, and 423 aircraft managed to travel over 3,000 miles without being spotted. As the Japanese fleet approached Hawaii, diplomatic efforts were still ongoing in Washington. Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu and Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura were meeting with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, ostensibly to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. But these negotiations were a charade. The Japanese government had already decided on war, and the diplomats were merely playing for time while the strike force positioned itself. The final piece of this diplomatic deception was a 14-part message from Tokyo to its Washington embassy, instructing the diplomats to break off negotiations. This message was intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, but due to delays in translation and delivery, the significance of the message wasn't fully appreciated until it was too late. The message was supposed to be delivered to Secretary Hull at 1 p.m. Washington time, just 30 minutes before the attack was scheduled to begin in Hawaii. Due to typing delays, the Japanese diplomats arrived at the State Department over an hour late, after the attack had already begun. This timing wasn't coincidental. The Japanese had planned for their diplomats to break off negotiations just before the attack, technically avoiding the charge of attacking without warning, while still maintaining the element of surprise. It was a calculated move that reflected the complex interplay of diplomacy and warfare that characterized the lead-up to Pearl Harbor. As dawn broke over Oahu on December 7, 1941, the Japanese strike force was in position approximately 230 miles north of Hawaii. At 6 a.m., the first wave of 183 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters launched from the 6 carriers. They approached Oahu from the north, using the mountains to shield their approach from radar detection. At 7:02 a.m., 2 Army privates operating a mobile radar station at Opana Point detected a large group of aircraft approaching from the north. They reported this to the information center, but the lieutenant on duty dismissed the sighting, assuming it was a flight of American B-17 bombers expected from California. This critical error allowed the Japanese aircraft to approach unimpeded. At 7:48 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the air attack, transmitted the famous signal, "Tora, Tora," indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The first wave struck military airfields across Oahu, destroying many American aircraft on the ground before they could take off. Simultaneously, torpedo bombers and dive bombers attacked the ships moored at Pearl Harbor. The devastation was immediate and catastrophic. The battleship USS Arizona was hit by a bomb that penetrated to its forward ammunition magazine, causing a massive explosion that killed 1,177 of its crew, nearly half of the total American casualties that day. The USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes and capsized, trapping many sailors inside. In total, all 8 U.S. battleships were damaged, with 4 sunk. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and various auxiliary vessels were also damaged or sunk. At 8:54 a.m., a second wave of 171 Japanese aircraft arrived, focusing on ships that had escaped the first attack and targeting shipyard facilities. By the time the attack ended shortly before 10 a.m., 2,403 Americans had been killed and 1,178 wounded. The Japanese lost just 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines, with 64 servicemen killed. Despite the heavy losses, the attack was not the strategic victory Japan had hoped for. Crucially, all 3 American aircraft carriers that were part of the Pacific Fleet were at sea during the attack and escaped unscathed. The Japanese also chose not to target the naval base's infrastructure, the power station, oil storage facilities, repair shops, and submarine base, which allowed the U.S. to quickly rebuild its forces. Admiral Yamamoto's feared sleeping giant had indeed been awakened, and the industrial might of America would soon be fully mobilized for war. The day after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Within an hour, Congress had declared war on Japan, with only one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their tripartite pact with Japan, declared war on the United States. America was now fully engaged in World War II, both in the Pacific and in Europe. The aftermath of Pearl Harbor transformed American society. The nation united behind the war effort in a way that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Industrial production shifted to military needs, with factories working around the clock to produce ships, planes, tanks, and ammunition. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers to replace men who had gone to fight. The attack galvanized American resolve and set the stage for the eventual Allied victory. For Japan, the initial euphoria of military success quickly gave way to the harsh reality that Yamamoto had predicted. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, marked a turning point in the Pacific War. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, and Japan lost many of its most experienced pilots. From that point on, Japan was on the defensive, gradually pushed back across the Pacific by the overwhelming industrial might of the United States. The road to Pearl Harbor offers valuable lessons about the dangers of cultural misunderstanding, the limitations of intelligence, and the consequences of diplomatic failure. Both sides made critical miscalculations. Japan underestimated America's resolve and capacity to wage war, while America underestimated Japan's military capabilities and willingness to take risks. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Pearl Harbor is the human cost. Behind the strategic calculations and diplomatic maneuverings were thousands of individuals whose lives were forever altered by the events of that December morning. American sailors who went to sleep on December 6th, never imagining they would be fighting for their lives the next day. Japanese pilots who knew they might not return from their mission, but flew anyway out of duty to their country. Civilians in both nations who would endure years of hardship and sacrifice as the war ground on. The story of Pearl Harbor reminds us that history is not inevitable. It is shaped by human decisions, sometimes made with incomplete information, sometimes clouded by prejudice or pride. The attack didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of a long series of events, each pushing both nations closer to conflict. Understanding this complexity doesn't diminish the tragedy of Pearl Harbor, but it does help us see it as more than just a surprise attack. It was a failure of diplomacy, a clash of cultures, and a turning point that would reshape the world. As we reflect on Pearl Harbor today, it's worth considering how different things might have been if other choices had been made. What if the US had better appreciated Japanese concerns about the oil embargo? What if Japanese leaders had recognized the futility of challenging American industrial might? What if the warning signs had been heeded and Pearl Harbor had been on high alert that Sunday morning? History doesn't offer do-overs, but it does offer lessons. If we're willing to look beyond the simplified narratives and engage with the full complexity of the past. The unseen countdown to Pearl Harbor wasn't just about military preparations and diplomatic maneuvers. It was about human beings making decisions that would echo through generations. By re-examining this pivotal moment with fresh eyes, we gain not just a better understanding of what happened on December 7, 1941, but also insights that might help us navigate our own complex world, where miscalculation and misunderstanding still threaten to push nations toward conflict.